Welcome to Carp 10 News at 8 p.m. My name is John Charles, and on tonight's segment, we will be discussing portions of the Cold War during the 1980s. Oh, I'm getting word of some breaking news. Oh, this just in. A stabbing at the University of Maryland. A man named Brendan Crack has been stabbed. Oh no. We'll come back to that later around 9 o'clock after we get to tonight's scheduled event. Ronald Reagan happens to be the 40th president of the United States of America. One of the big things that came from Ronald Reagan's presidency, actually prior to his presidency, mostly from Carter, was this movement called the New Right, which was really a far-right movement that was developed prior to Reagan and really pressured U.S. policymakers in an unprecedented way. In addition, one of the major foreign policies during Reagan's administration was the, quote, Reagan Doctrine. It was pretty much when Ronald Reagan pledged support for anti-communist revolutions around the world, and this was done in his State of the Union address. So to discuss more about Ronald Reagan, I'm going to bring in my associate, Mr. Robert Buckmaster Jr.
How are you, John Charles?
Mr. Buckmaster?
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about with Reagan was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was also known as SDI or Star Wars, the idea of launching a satellite into space as a form of defense against nuclear weaponry, the satellite would shoot down any nuclear weapons that were fired upon enemies of the United States or any sort of enemy of NATO, as well as the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was also known as INF, where the USSR and the United States agreed to cut down on their nuclear weaponry, which was more specifically the United States cut down their nuclear missiles known as the Pershing and the cruiser missiles, and the USSR got rid of their SS-20 nuclear missiles, which are both intermediate ranged nuclear missiles, hence the name Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. The idea of back to SDI, which was a very controversial topic between the USSR and the United States, it got rid of the MAD theory, which John Charles would like to talk more about.
Yeah, that was, MAD is pretty much stands for Mutually Assured Destruction, and this is why Gorbachev had a problem with SDI, and pretty much everyone had a problem with it, is because it got rid of MAD, which basically said that the US had no reason to not intervene and to not declare war on the USSR, which really did scare Gorbachev. So this was definitely a big leap in his foreign policy. And now, to discuss more on Ronald Reagan, we will bring in the Samuel Meritato.
So one thing to discuss within Reagan's presidency is the reinstatement of the arms race during the Cold War. So during this time, after détente occurred, Reagan started to increase U.S. funding for nuclear weapons, as he knew that the Soviet Union wouldn't be able to afford this massive increase in funding towards any weaponry. So it was basically a chance to put the USSR into great debt and then finally put an end to the Cold War in Reagan's eyes. And then to further go on the arms race, there was the PSYOPs program, where basically U.S. pilots would fly as close as possible to the Soviet border, in a way playing a game of chicken with their defenses. And basically the whole idea was to get as close as possible to the Soviet Union before getting shot down. So you get as close as possible and then turn around. This eventually led to the Korean Airlines flight 007, which was a Boeing 747 commercial flight, which actually changed its path and ended up flying over Soviet airspace, which is prohibited to commercial airlines. And the USSR originally thought that it was actually a U.S. spy plane looking into the Soviet Union. So after sending off a few warning shots and hearing no response, they decided to shoot the plane down. And this caused much controversy and an uproar in the United States, and a much bitter taste towards communism and USSR. Lastly, there was the Iran-Contra, which was an event where Reagan wanted to support the Nicaraguan Contra rebels. So in order to do this, he sold many weapons to Iran illegally in exchange for money in order to support these Contras. This gave him the name of Teflon President, where people still, even after this, contradicted event, he was still a very popular president. People loved him. Now, Blake Stoddard on Afghanistan and Gorbachev.
Hello. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, there's extreme controversy surrounding it. This period ended détente, which was a temporary lull in the Cold War. The invasion of Afghanistan officially marked the Second Cold War as it became known. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, their mission was to establish a friendly state to the south of them, as well as prevent a Muslim government from being established in Afghanistan. To do this, they assassinated the leader Amin, and there were extreme parallels to the Vietnam War fought by the United States a decade earlier. Diem was the leader that the Vietnamese had to assassinate, and just as the Americans had troubles with the guerrillas in Vietnam, so did the Soviets in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen were the Muslim freedom fighters who were coming from Afghanistan as well as Pakistan, and were being supported by the Americans with arms and other aid such as food and supplies. One of the major problems that the Mujahideen faced in opposing the Soviet Union were their helicopters and the air superiority they had. None of the weapons provided to the Mujahideen were capable of dealing with these helicopters. So the United States of America provided Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen, which were capable of shooting down the helicopters. Once this occurred, the Soviet Union no longer had any pressure or way of bringing Mujahideen or their allies to the negotiating table. And here to discuss Gorbachev, who was one of the main leaders in pulling the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan after a decade of conflict, is Robert. Robert?
Hey, Blake.
So, would you like to discuss the two policies that Gorbachev is most famous for, Glasnost and Perestroika?
Yes. Glasnost was this idea of openness with the Soviet people. Up until Gorbachev came into power, the Soviet people, the Soviet people were living under this idea of censorship where, the government controlled all of the media that reached all of the information that reached the Soviet people. So they thought that the war in Afghanistan was going well up until this point that Gorbachev introduced this idea of glasnost, where the media actually reported on what was actually happening rather than what the government wanted the people to see. This caused social unrest in the USSR, as the people were upset that they were losing the war in Afghanistan, which caused pressure against Gorbachev to bring his country out of Afghanistan. Alright, cut. Alright. As for Perestroika, it was this idea of modernizing the Soviet economy, which was before Perestroika was a war economy. About 80% of all industry went towards the military, and such as tanks, weapons, nuclear weapons, stuff like that. But after Perestroika, it was modernizing the economy to a more consumerist economy. It was more consumer friendly. It would lead to more luxury goods and much less of military power than beforehand.
Overall, Gorbachev was an extremely interesting figure during the 1980s, during the Cold War, reaching a cult status in the United States, which was known as Gorbymania, and becoming fast friends with Ronald Reagan, who they had multiple meetings with over the years to help end the Cold War and bring about peace and change to the entire world. Back to you in the studio, John Charles.
To end this segment on the Cold War, we will discuss a few of the events that have ended the Cold War, mostly European movements such as the Solidarity Movement, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the USSR's withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. It seems as though I'm getting some breaking news. I'll let them know. Reports are showing that a drunken man in an Islanders hockey game has attempted assaulting an Islanders fan. The reports show that the fan swung, missed, and the victim walked away unharmed. Have a good night, Karpet News.
Hello viewers, welcome back. We have just received an update on the previous story, that it was in fact the fan's favorite jersey that caused the confrontation between him and the drunken man. Now, to talk about the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, and this marked a severe change in Soviet foreign policy. They had to do so with no concessions on the treaties signed or the peace accords, due to their lack of pressure as a result of the Stinger missiles being provided and the nullification of their air superiority. Samuel will discuss the Solidarity Movement in Poland.
Yes, in addition to this, the USSR began to deteriorate when in Poland the Solidarity Movement began. They were a group who was fighting for workers' rights in Poland, and it helped them pull out of the Soviet Union and their control.
Various other independence movements sprang up across Eastern Europe, and the symbolic end of the Cold War occurred when, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and Berlin was reunited, and Cold War ended. Thank you, viewers, and have a nice night.